little way to randomize groups. Right? There's really very little of it. It's hard to do. It takes a lot of money. The second problem here with the research on extensive reading is what we saw in the results of the National Reading Panel. Now, true, this is the United States and not somewhere else, but nonetheless, there's a big research literature, and they couldn't find persuasive, rigorous evidence. There was plenty of evidence, but on their criteria, there wasn't a lot. So it's hard to make a case to these types of people. And these type of people, in the United States at least, made government policy. Now, sustained silent reading may not be a strong model for extensive reading, so I'll stop here for a second. I sort of toyed with this. There's two studies in the Elfriede Hebert book where Ray Reutzel and a couple colleagues compared sustained silent reading and what he called scaffolded silent reading. You can imagine one involves the teacher as model, just reading in front of the class and just pick up your books. And of course there's other rules that help, but not too much. And then scaffolded, where you end up with thinking about ways that the teacher works to engage readers, whether it's some activities, whether it's some comprehension, whether it's just helping to pick the right books. And you might say, well, that makes sense. But actually, then what is extensive reading and what is sustained silent reading if we can't have this sort of pure definition? And when you get to a fairly pure definition, in this case, he had two studies and showed that the teacher engaged as coach or support person was better than the teacher as example in the front of the room reading. Okay? So this is, now, we need more research, but these are two outcomes. Research often examines what's done rather than what could be done in extensive reading. So, I've been doing extensive reading for 3 years. I partner up with a researcher, and we decide, does this work? Well, you're doing it based on what you're doing. Not necessarily sitting back and saying, well, could we make this better before we do the study? Do we have any evidence of how to make this better? So this is it. There's limited methodology research in extensive reading. So among 4 ways to carry out a certain activity or idea within extensive reading, which of the 4 turn out to be better? Okay? It is very limited. There's limited support intervention to promote engagement. So what do we know about how teachers try to engage students and their effectiveness? And if we look at a couple variations, which one's the best? There's limited group work research. So if we use group work, how do we do it in the best way to support extensive reading? SLA, just to jump off, because I always hammer a little bit on SLA. SLA emphasizes research that privileges the explicit learning system rather than the implicit learning system. 6 years ago, I was at Island. I gave a talk. And at the time, the big volume of Doty and Long Handbook of Second Language Acquisition was there. I held it up to everyone, and I said, there is only one reference to reading in the entire 900 pages, and it has nothing to do with research or what to do. Wow. That was it, 900 pages of the Handbook of SLA. We don't exist. Okay? I have these discussions regularly. Okay. Another problem, we have limited immediate gains from extensive reading practice. We have to live with that fact. You can't turn around in 1 week and see gains from extensive reading. But you can if you teach a grammar point. Okay? So this is a big difference, actually. We have difficulty in maintaining extensive reading programs over a sufficiently long period of time and with a sufficient intensity of reading engagement. I've come here, and it seems like in Japan you've overcome this hurdle a fair amount. But still, there's more work to be done, and in other countries, forget it. They're not close to approaching this hurdle. A 6th problem, I got 9, right? The 6th problem was implementing extensive reading. So we have limited teacher training on how to motivate students to find interesting materials and maintain student engagement over time. We have limited awareness of how to combine some in-class reading with additional reading at home. What is the right mix? Do we have a study that varies 3 or 4 variations of this mix and find out what might work? And you might say, wait a minute. You have different proficiency levels, they're reading different materials, they come from different backgrounds. You can't, it's hard to do this. Right? Hey, you could say the same thing about SLA. back in the 1970s, they jumped in, started to do research. There was a million variables, and they started somewhere. Okay? But you have to build the sort of the research frame within ER, not ER compared to something else. There's limited effort to ensure some accountability for actually reading the amount of reading claimed. Now, maybe Moodle Reader will do this. We don't know, and maybe, but we don't have a lot of research on this. We need to move away from the one-size-fits-all model. And again, that's my little jab at sustained silent reading, right? Because you do the same thing no matter what the proficiency level is, no matter what the context is. Now, I'm exaggerating a little bit. It's my job. Problems with ways to build more consistent research methodologies for extensive reading studies. So this is an extension of point 5, a little bit. How much time should be devoted to in-class extensive reading? How much time to out-of-class? Better readers, we think, should do longer extensive reading than weaker readers. Weaker readers may not have the stamina. But is this true? We don't really know. Actually, there is some research going on in that group of L1, but I don't know of any L2 research that's worked on that. The idea is that the more in-class extensive reading you do, the better. Well, actually, there is a couple pieces of evidence from the L1 where as you increase the amount of minutes, you get better results. But you have to sort of control that observation. How much of the time for extensive reading are students productively engaged in reading? So this is time on task plus deliberate practice. Okay? So time on task is critical, but it isn't the only variable here. And how do we ensure more reading at students' proficiency levels or a little below and limit the amount of exposure with harder texts? And there is some research to show in the L1, these recent studies, that as students read more difficult texts, their motivation goes down, the amount of reading goes down. You know, it's measurable, and they've measured it. So it's worth looking at some of this. How do we move away from one side? Forget it, I've hammered that one. Okay, how do we vary high-low proficiency groups? Should we vary them? Should we think about different tasks and texts for struggling readers? Well, do we have controlled research that gives us some idea about that? Should we be grouping strong and weak when we do group work, or should we be grouping strong and strong? Okay? And how does that impact extensive reading? Now, two last problems. The problem, why isn't everyone doing this? Well, we need active, consistent teacher support for student motivation and engagement in extensive reading. What exactly do we do so that teachers will be the best motivators? Do we know? Do we have a consistent set of studies that help us with that? Well, some people might agree, think so, but no, I think it's a problem. And then finally, effective teacher development and teacher training. How do we train teachers to be effective extensive reading teachers? And do we have a research base for it? Okay. Now, let me tell you, I have on your handout, and I'm about at the end, and I think I've got a few more minutes, but I've got 26 ideas.
Your microphone is
Right. We've got 26 ideas. I'll just hold it. All right. You know, these Indonesian shirts, they get tired. But they're very nice. So my 26 ideas, they're things that I've been thinking about and working with teachers. But in fact, after being here, hey, these ideas are much better. Okay, so I'm not so worried about these 26 ideas. A few might ring a bell with you, and you can look through it. So I'm going to not worry about that. But I will worry about the idea that these ideas, for the most part, whether my 26 or in here, are mostly suggestions. Now, they're suggestions built out of long experience. They're suggestions built out of common sense. They're suggestions where a group of people get together and they realize it does work. But they're not grounded specifically in research. Some might be, but a lot of them aren't. And I think this is part of the reason why it is hard to persuade people who are not believers in extensive reading that extensive reading should be in the core of the curriculum. Right? So I think this is really the issue. So I'm going to float right through these 26. Boy, that was good. Now, this is my point. For all 26 practical suggestions, do we really have research on these techniques to know better ways to implement these ideas? So it's part, in the questionnaire, it's not the true false, it's how confident are we in what we're saying. There's far too many suggestions and ideas for teaching extensive reading, and far too little research on the specifics of instructional techniques and options internally to extensive reading. So you have 3 people doing extensive reading, they're systematically varying. How do we know which of those 3 seem to work better? Now there's some of this, but there isn't a standard base that builds up over a lot of issues. There's still a lot of work to be done. But there has been major progress in the last 10 years. So, here I come to the extensive reading Congress, and I say, oh, you need to do all this. Hey, it's remarkable what's happened in the last 10 years. It's clear that Japan has turned a corner. You can talk about extensive reading to your colleagues, and they accept that it's in the curriculum. That's not true in most countries still. Right? So this is really just the front that has to be pushed and move into other countries. This conference provides a lot of evidence that progress has been made, and we know that students learn to read by reading, and by reading a lot. Okay, so that was my effort to be controversial. And now, I'd like you to look, I have 2 minutes. I would like you to look back at the questionnaire, the survey, the 10 items. Now, I've tried, some more directly, some indirectly, to address the reasoning for my choices in those 10 items. But in fact, some of those, I wrote these 10 items before I came here. Right? So, there's certain things that I've been persuaded about that I would probably change that wording a little bit. So if I've said something that particularly irritates you, well, I'm sure that's the one I would have changed now. So I think I'll end there. We will have to go to lunch, and people really need their sustenance because we are really spending a lot of energy in all these sessions, right? Okay.